Good morning. First of all, I would like to thank INCIBE for having invited the Joint Commander of Cyber Defense for inviting us to this meeting and for giving us the opportunity to share what we do in terms of the cyberspace. And Manuel is Manuel Sanz Baselga. I'm a lieutenant colonel, and I'm here to tell you how we understand cyberspace and also to show you what are our capabilities, our missions, and what is the understanding that we have of army operations. First of all, we have to ask ourselves the following question: is the cyberspace a new battleground? Well, sometimes we could think that in cyberspace we only find criminal activities. And from the viewpoint of citizens, that's what we are seeing more and more. However, we should also think about the power of nations, and whether that power is now being implemented not only in the physical sphere, but also in the cyberspace. And now, a number of characteristics that will help us identify whether we will be facing conflict in the cyberspace. As we all know, the cyberspace is a virtual environment with no geographical limits. And what is the consequence of that? It is that several actors in different places in the world have take action in other places that with no geographical boundaries. Another common component is that the devices that are being used in the cyberspace were not originally designed for them to be secure, but to be fast and efficient. We have these two components, and if we add to that in cyberspace, essential, vital activities for nowadays societies are being carried out there, well, we're starting to see a breeding ground here. So there are activities such as health, transportation, economy, energy. All those sectors are supported in technologies that are located on the cyberspace. So therefore, there are highly valuable elements in the cyberspace, and that cyberspace is not a secure place. And if this is not a secure place, we will be finding situations that happen in the physical world and they have their counterpart in the cyberspace. And with this I mean crime, terrorism, and espionage. Crime looking for fast economic benefits. Terrorism, it is based and supports itself in anonymity. And then espionage. Espionage, that is to say, using espionage. And why that? Espionage is based on gathering sensitive information, important information, either from states, from governments, or from industries or corporations. Many years ago, that sensitive information was on paper and used to be kept in safes. Therefore, nowadays it is not the case anymore, and therefore the espionage services of several states are strengthening their efforts in terms of espionage. So we are seeing now, many more components of cyberspace. The next component characteristics is armed conflicts. Is there an interest to deploy armed conflicts on the cyberspace? An armed conflict is an armed conflict between two states. That is to say, one state trying to impose its power over the other. And cyberspace, does it allow a state to do that? Yes, it does. And how do powerful states use it to impose their will and power. They do it, and now we also have states that are not very strong, and by developing tools, they may end up imposing the will and power over more powerful states. And now, let us add to the list of characteristics this very last one. No arm control, no weapon control. In the physical world, we are aware of the companies manufacturing weapons. We have a record as to how they are distributed, to whom. But here in the cyberspace, there is no control whatsoever. I can develop a cyber weapon and I can sell it, and there is no control over it. And I can store it. I don't need a big storage facility to store cyber weapon. And cyber weapon have consequences in the cyber world, and these consequences end up being translated in the physical world as well. And then one more component, the anonymity. So we are all very well aware of the consequences of being anonymous on the internet versus being anonymous in the real world. In the real world, it is difficult to be anonymous, but in the virtual world, it is not as difficult. So are we going to have armed conflicts here? Yes, of course. And then the legal framework. Is there a legal framework for cyberspace? At the international level, there is no legal framework. At a national level, yes, there is a legal framework, but not all the countries have a legal framework. Does Spain have a legal framework for cyberspace? Yes, it is. Is it easy being implemented? No, it is not easy because of anonymity, because issues with attribution. So that's a situation that we face. Is the army there? Yes, of course. We are very much present there. So our framework reference is NATO. So let us see how NATO defines the cyberspace. It is defined as a global domain. And this is extremely important for us. Global domain. What does it mean? It means that it is being separated from the rest of the domains. So we have the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, land, sea, air, space, and now we have a new domain, the global dominion. That's here where we will have the activities of the army, of the NATO forces deployed. That's where the NATO forces will deploy their activities in this global dominion. And then it is said that it is made up by ITC systems as well as other electronic systems, and their interaction and information is stored and transmitted. And now I'd like to review with you two more definitions, which is very important to understand them to move on with our talk. Cyber war. When we read the papers, we read cyber war and say, oh, there is a cyber war between the US and Russia. Is there an actual cyber war in the cyberspace? After this conference, after this talk, I would like you to be clear about this concept. Well, sometimes we talk lightly about this cyber war in the cyberspace. What are we talking about? Are we talking about two states, two nations fighting with each other? Well, and this has always been so on land. By the moment we started to see human activity on land, we started to see groups of interest, nations, and we started to see armed conflicts. Then that dimension was transferred, or was started to be seen on sea and then air. It was a bit more complex at sea than on land, but it reached the sea dimension. Then the airspace. This conflict became more and more because more complex systems were needed to take the armed conflicts to the airspace. And then another new dimension, the space. Many outer space Some countries have not reached there because so far they haven't had the economic or financial capabilities to do it. As you can see, all these dimensions become increasingly complex. And now we have the cyberspace. Is this more complex? Yes, it is very complex. Can we really develop offensive capabilities for this new demand? No, it is not difficult. It is relatively easy. You don't really need very many financial resources to do it. And I'm saying this so that you have a better understanding as to see how states are using their armed forces to fight the threats in cyberspace. So now, what are the threats in cyberspace? Threats that we suffer. We suffer them all as citizens in our nations, and the threats that we suffer as a nation. So these are the threats. You are well aware of them. Here we have different threats, we have different techniques. Sometimes the techniques are confused with the actual threats, but here I'd like to take four groups. Cybercrime, we are all victims of it. Then activism developed in cyberspace, that is to say hacktivism, cyber espionage, and cyber war. Threats. Well, threats are those four that I mentioned before. Let us look at them in greater detail. Which are the most dangerous threats? Well, we could tend to think that cyber criminals are the most dangerous. No, actually, no. The states are the most dangerous because they have the personnel and the resources to make these threats. And they also have the time. They have the time to do it and to develop their activities. And they also carry out and lead operations whenever they need it. They are kind of acts of war, and these operations can be directly managed by them or through third parties. What are other actors here? We have the transnational actors. We should not forget there are no boundaries here, there are no frontiers, and there are groups of people who are active on the internet whose aim is to carry out hacktivism or just to carry out terrorist acts. And criminal organizations, they are not limited by any boundaries. Their objective is financial gains. Their campaigns have consequences to all of us, impact us all. And on top of that, these organizations could also share the services or work for states or for the groups that we mentioned before. So these criminal organizations sometimes can work for states. And then we have the individual players or small groups. They are driven by several motivations, different motivations. And what is the danger? The danger is that may work for any of the previous groups. And after seeing the threats and background that I gave you before, now we see that cyber weapons are not expensive. And then if we add to it that high efficiency, we end up having a significant asymmetry. We, the army, do not like to have an asymmetric rival. We like to have a rival that is a peer and that is at the same level, but it is not the case. So, distribution of attacks. These are sources for this year, 2016. This is the distribution. This is what we have to face on a day-to-day basis. On a daily basis, we primarily face cybercrime. Here, in hacktivism, we don't have to face it as much. Here, this is more state-related. Sometimes these activism groups, they are against the state. They try to push for their ideas, and we are most impacted by cyber espionage and cyber warfare. We, as Spanish nations, we haven't been victims of any cyberware so far. And now we move on. After seeing the threats, now let us talk about the missions, the purposes, and the capacity of the Joint Commands of Cyber Defense. What is our mission, and what are the capacities that we have developed for it? Our mission is given to us by Royal Decree 872-2014. That decree has been established by the armed forces, and this includes the Joint Command of the Cyber Defense. And we are given two missions here: to carry out cyber defense actions, that is to say, to defending our networks and the networks of the Ministry for Defense. This is important. We defend our networks, or those that we are asked to defend. That's our main area of work, defense of our networks. And we have also been given another mission, that being given adequate response. When we say adequate is synonym with legal and with other things. We have to give adequate response in the cyberspace in the face of threats or aggressions. And that mission has been granted to us through that royal decree. What are the capacities that we have developed to carry out our mission? We have developed a defensive capacity. This is the first one that we developed, and it includes a number of preventative, proactive, and reactive measures. Then, an exploitation capacity. So we should not extrapolate it and think that this refers to exploits or vulnerabilities. Not at all. Exploitation means that we want to be aware of the situation in the cyberspace, in the area where we will be working. What for? To produce, to develop intelligence, to find out about the intentions of potential attackers, and then to promote, to foster early alarm. And the third one is response. Response has to be adequate, as I mentioned before. That means that it should be legit, should be according to law. We don't break the law in the physical world, and we should not break the law in the cyberspace. Response should be legit and opportune, timely. Is it legit to defend myself or to respond with the same cyber attack? First of all, I need to attribute that attack to the attacker. Sometimes it takes 6 months. And having the IP address of the machine is not enough. I need to attribute it to a physical person. I need to attribute the cyber person to a physical person. That could be very complicated. Sometimes it takes 6 months for me to attribute the cyber attack. And do I respond? Well, I respond as long as it is opportune. And 6 months later, it's not opportune. And then the response has to be proportionate. I cannot really cause huge damage to those that have attacked me. These are three limits that we have when it comes to giving a response. Now, defense capacities. I will be fast through this section, and because I'm sure that most of you here have done this before and you are well aware of it. Preventative measures. We work in terms of physical security. We have access control. So we try to contain pretest attacks. also upgrading of applications, antiviruses. These are preventative actions that are more used by most of the organizations or people involved in defense capacities. And we also work in system securitization. We make them secure from the design. We also carry out analysis to detect vulnerabilities, to fix them. We also do lots of training both nationally and internationally. We also foster, we disseminate and send out alerts to our users in the face of threats, and we very much work on awareness raising so that people become aware of the dangers that they may be facing. Then number of proactive measures such as inspections, auditings, so that systems are well accredited, monitoring. We are monitoring all the time the traffic that goes through our network. We pen test. This help us strengthen the access controls and monitoring, and then reactive measures. We restore system, we manage incidents, we do forensic analysis, we look for attribution, and if through attribution traceability we manage to identify the person who has committed the crime, we promote, we implement legal actions. Now, defense capacity, this is infographics. We have system administrator, the the operating authority. What do we do from the joint command? We monitor all the elements of this flowchart. Whenever we detect illegal activity, we manage the incidents, we provide technical support, we have immediate response teams, because our networks are not only deployed in national territory but also international territory. We have our personnel were distributed all over the world. We have clients all over the world. And as I say, whenever there is an incident, we provide immediate response. And then we also have a forensic team. Forensic team that help us work not only with malware but with the actual activity, with the actual incidents. Exploitation capacities, I went through them quickly before, but at the end of the day, what we really need to be aware of is, in terms of the potential attackers, we really need to know how they are organized. And here we are talking about nations. We are talking about the army, the armed forces of other countries, devoting time and resources to organize these criminal activities. We really want to find out about the tactics, the techniques, the procedures, and we are all the time looking into it, all the time monitoring that. We try to identify possible attacks, potential threats, potential attacks, to trigger that early alarm that I mentioned before. We have those capacities, and then, well, all that can be used for us to implement offensive actions if needed. Response capacity, offensive capacity, is one of the three pillars that we have. And what is this response about? Well, actions against adversaries that have an impact on the integrity or availability of the information system and telecommunication system. The armed forces has a command and control system. So all organizations have a command and control chain. Ours, same as that of other companies, is strongly supported on information technologies. If the command and control chain of the armed forces cannot use the ITC, it is like if we were blocking our nervous system. No matter how strong our muscles are, if we need nervous system. So this is one of the objectives of the armed forces of any country whenever they go into armed conflicts. Command and control system is made null and void. And now we can do that more easily than in the past. So we've seen that, we've seen capabilities, and now let us move on to military operations in the cyberspace. So a definition here, we, armed forces, like very much to go through definitions. I understand that they may be a bit boring, but it is good so that we all end up sharing a language. Military operation in the cyberspace. We don't refer to it as cyber operation. I don't like to use the prefix cyber all the time, cybersecurity, cyber operation, because sometimes this may make it be less serious. I prefer to talk about military operation in the cyberspace. Well, even if you read cyber whatever in my presentation, I prefer all military operation. So this is an operation same as any other that uses cyber capacity to achieve military objective, whether it takes place in the cyberspace or through it. I may achieve a military objective in the cyberspace or through the cyberspace. And now, armed attack in the cyberspace. This is essential. It is essential because understanding what an armed attack is helps us understand self-defense according to international law, where I can self-defend myself as an state and where I cannot do it. An armed attack is an attack that causes a damage, physical damage on individuals and in objects. That's the real world. And what happens in the virtual world? Exactly the same. For me, you consider that an attack is an armed attack. I need to have damage on people and objects. Sometimes in papers we read has been attacked in the cyberspace. This is one more component of the cyber world. This is cyber attack. No. Let us find what are the latest attacks in the cyberspace that have caused physical damage. Well, only few of them than that. So this is like the third world that is taking place in the cyberspace. What is how much damage has been caused? Let us go beyond that. Terrorist actions. I'm not talking about armed attacks. Armed attacks are carried out by states. But terrorist actions, have they taken advantage of the cyberspace to cause physical damage on people? Yes, they have done that, but that is not cyber world. Well, I would say war in the cyberspace. That is terrorism taking advantage of the cyberspace. And now, effects in cyberspace. We armed forces like to talk all the time about the effects, the impact that we will be having on. So, well, this could be a bit redundant. Effects affecting how information system, confidentiality, and integrity, availability of information is affected. We have heard that before. We have to protect our information so that it is not infiltrated, so that it is not tampered with, so that it stays in place, so that it is not tampered with, and so that it ends up generating mistrust in our activities, or we cannot work with it anymore. And we also have to safeguard the availability of our information. This is what we always do to protect these three elements. And now, military operations. We are working on that, which is the structure. Every time we carry out a military action, our CNC system is made up of the following elements. Operation command. It is a joint command including personnel from the three armies. And then it has a component command on land, then on sea. So remember that in the beginning we talked about the space. We just don't have capacity as armed forces to act on the outer space, but we just have special operation commands, and then we also have the component command in the cyberspace, and that's us. We are the joint command of cyberspace. Area of operation, where do we work? We work in the cyberspace, of course, but we do not work in the whole cyberspace. Our system, networks and systems, ITC systems, from the Ministry of Defense in the national territory. We work to defend our operations abroad as well. So whether it is peace missions or other type of missions where we are present abroad. And also other tasks that we may be granted. And then we also have a variable area. Now at this point, are we involved in an armed conflict? No, we are not. No nation is free from being embarked into an armed conflict. Of course, all nations have to be ready for that. All in all, the surface to defend is really, really large because there are more and more elements connected to the internet. We have smaller and smaller devices. However, with capacities that can end up causing lots of harm on states. This is one of the big problems or huge problems that we are facing. How to defend this large surface? How can I defend myself against a nuclear threat? It is virtually impossible. Nuclear defense. Some countries decided to arm themselves just to be sufficiently armed just in case they were attacked. Cyberspace may develop, may progress in that direction. If you've been a network administrator before, you know that sometimes you don't have enough resources to defend network 100%. Everything that I receive by email, is it safe? When we how do you manage, how do you make your users not to say yes or to accept everything? This is very difficult to do. You know that you cannot defend yourself fully. However, you have offensive capacities, and therefore this is a deterrent. You go and say, okay, you are strong, but I am also strong.
Desde el punto de vista militar, ¿no?
That's how cyberspace activity can go down for the military field. How do we plan operations? Same as with any other dimension. We don't have a different plan and strategy for that dimension. It's just the same, and we integrate it with all other operations. It doesn't make much sense. But it could be that we could have operations with just one cyber component. No, it's not like that. It's just another component, but it is always a joint operation. There is a land component, and it's all synchronized from the bottom level, that it's tactic, all the way up to the strategic level. And there are two sub-processes within the planning process. First one would be cyber targeting. And what do we do there? So you need to consider it would be an operation as part of an armed conflict, so it is offensive. It is something we do on a daily basis. Cyber targeting then means that we identify targets that are to be offensively attacked. We prioritize them and assign effects that are to be achieved, and then we've got another sub-process kicking in, that it's cyber weaponering, and we decide what we are going to do, what method to follow, and maybe we replicate the target in our virtual environment. But cyber weapons, we know the effects they cause, if it's excessive effect, if it's controllable effect, and if it fits into what it's desired as an outcome. And it is closest to the real world because we can replicate systems on which we can act offensively, and sometimes in the real world this is not possible. Kinds of operations. I'm well aware that I've been talking for some time now, and so lots of military components. I'm not sure whether you will be able to digest all the remaining slides for the conference. Let's discuss briefly, so that it is not too boring. What kind of operations are there that have to do with capabilities? We have defensive operations to keep our maneuver, so we can still work inside information systems. That's the target, and as we said, is protecting, is monitoring, is responding. I will not dwell on that, but I will dwell on the types. Well, actually, I've already explained that. Our networks, our working networks, or protecting a specific system against a given threat. It could happen. Our air force system can be attacked by a given threat, and so we focus on that very specific skill set. Exploitation operations that have to do with our capability to exploit activities, also information on our adversaries, times of peace and armed conflict as well. We keep getting information on the source of attacks, so we work on it. And there are different kinds. And for those who have a more technical profile, it might ring a bell. It's intelligence, open source intelligence. OSINT, that's the name. And we recover what's out there in the outer space or elsewhere. We get information that we get from DS system. We have Google hacking as well. We get information out of websites. We work with file metadata. We get interesting things out of all that. So far, nothing out of legality. There's nothing preventing people from doing this. But we also have passive recognition. We list devices. We see which devices that are active. We can even we have the skills to have port scanning, see what ports are active, closed, disabled, protocols running on those ports, services running on those as well. We do have the capability. Doesn't mean we are doing it, but we have the capability, and when necessary it will be done. We identified operating systems, we analyze vulnerabilities, and then we are in a position to gather information. So since we've gathered information, we will be able to use it when needed. And then there's a third side to it, that it's advanced persistent threat. This is something that cannot be done at times of peace, and that it's penetrating systems of the adversaries and exfilter information constantly. Then offensive operations. I will not dwell on that. Degrading, interrupting, destroying. It's always synchronized with all other dimensions, by the way. And often we need previous exploitation operations to have offensive operations later on. Our operations, we control them. We've got different control levels. There's this control authority for cyberspace, which is the one authorizing activities out in cyberspace. Same way, we have one control unit for Air Force activities. We've got one for cyberspace. We've got at CNC for driving. This is C for D. And then we have some mission commands where we commission units to carry out operations. This has been a bit dense, I guess, but I guess it's interesting to hear about it at some time. And what about the law? Is regular law applicable to cyberspace, the ordinary law system that we have? Is it? Does it work? Yes, no, it should, but it's not used. As we see it, I mean, armed forces and cyberspace operations, that's our approach. And international treaties, are they applicable to the cyberspace? Yes. It's not just as Spanish armed forces, but it is actually White House's cyber strategy. White House, one of the main powers, and they understand that the international legislation, that it's valid, is used all over the world, at peace and at war, at peace, at times of peace and of war. And there are no specific treaty, international treaty, contrary to the sea, where there is a specific treaty for this dimension, which is international and applicable to all nations. Is there a specific treaty for cyberspace? There's not. There are there task forces working on it? Yes. United Nations. Do all countries agree? No, actually there are some divergences. So in the short term it will be difficult to get specific treaties for cyberspace. Still, there are a few documents, there's a few manuals helping us interpret international legislation in the field of armed conflicts. This is Tallinn's manual, Tallinn, capital of Estonia. That's where the cyber defense center for the NATO is, and they have this manual that interprets international legislation for armed conflicts. Then, sovereignty. Nation states are sovereign, and so are their infrastructures then. Infrastructures that have a cyber component, and everything happening about them, the state is sovereign and responsible, is to be held accountable. And often there are structures in a country that are used as a proxy to conduct activities elsewhere, and that's where the countries are accountable. Use at bellum. That's what we call justice before war. So at times of peace. What's the legislation? Well, the national law for each country. Do we have it in Spain? Yes. Specifically for cyberspace actions? Yes. They are part of the criminal code. And as a crime, it typifies an unauthorized access to systems. This is a crime that has a prison sentence or unauthorized interruption of a system, so causing a denial of service on a system. And it is used both on source country, but if I, such as I work from Spain, but I use proxies in Germany, Iceland, or Zambia, and the final target is in a different country, I go through so many countries for my criminal activity or my activity outside the law, and I would be subject to all the laws, the starting country, the intermediary countries, and the target country as well. And that's nationally speaking. Then internationally, is there an international law for times of peace? Yes, the UN Charter that regulates the use of force. And the use of force is prohibited, specifically prohibited in times of peace. Two exceptions: that the Security Council would authorize it to re-establish world peace or preserve world peace. This is one of the exceptions. And then Article 51, I could use force as self-defense in case of an armed attack, harm to people, damages to objects. So can I get an attack out in the cyberspace from a X country? Can I reply back? Is it considered an armed attack? Can I exercise my self-defense right? Is there harm? Is there damage involved? We need to look into that. This is something that needs to be assessed. Is it fully identified, or is it just a suspicion that I have? So it ain't easy. Self-defense is not so easy to be justified in the cyberspace. For armed conflict, just in balance, so during war, international humanitarian law is used here, and there are some parameters, distinctions, such as civilians and military people. What I do, the military, if it causes damage or harm within an armed conflict, cannot harm civilians and the military. We cannot say there is a military infrastructure, which is a factory, and that's weapon production, getting supply from a power plant, and I get a cyber access because it's connected to the internet, and I can turn it down. Do I turn it down? I can just black it out. Do I? Or do I need to understand who else is getting its supply from it? Maybe it's a hospital. And do I know whether there is an energy backup at the hospital to produce energy? I might cause a blackout that would last for 2 days, and there would be civilians dying because of it. This is something that we really look into before starting an offensive operation. Proportionality. We said it already. Only necessary damages for the military edge or advantage and conflict, right? We are not conflict now, but it is all about preserving lives insofar as possible. I only have a few minutes left. I had with me a few real operations. I have only a few minutes left, right? But we've all heard about it, and the idea is to see if we can identify as a war act in cyberspace or not. Let me rush through this. Red October, offensive operation starting in 2007. We think it is still active. Target is diplomatic agencies and governments all over the world. Affects information exfiltration. So the one starting this information wants to get information out illegally. Physical attack. Is it a war act? It is not. It is cyber espionage. It happens in times of peace and war all the time. Estonia, the attack back in 2007, it was offensive, yes. Target was to freeze the administration, state administration of Estonia. It was a denial of service, and in turn, it also meant that the Excellence Center of the NATO was created. Botnet through more than 170 countries. 170 countries. We cannot track it down. We cannot have it set traceability. Is it an act of war? Is it an armed attack? Were there casualties, physical or harm or damage? This is sabotage. It cannot be understood as cyberspace war. Real operations. Backshot Yankee 2008. Offensive operation. Still, what gets our eye is the defensive part. The target was the Defense Department of the United Nations. Effects, the information exfiltration, and then the Joint Command for Cyber Defense was created in the US. Attack vector, USB that was infected and left over there at a parking lot, and they infected the whole network of the Defense Department. Is it an attack on the armed forces of the United States, or is it cyber espionage? It is cyber espionage. Georgia, Ossetia, Southern Ossetia. Offensive operation. The target was the nation state's administration. Was there an armed conflict? Yes, there was, between Georgia and Russia. They are involved in an armed conflicts. Denial of service, traffic deviation, servers, botnets, taking control over servers. This is a cyber attack as part of an armed conflict before an offensive. So they were laying the ground before starting the offensive. So this is war in the cyberspace. So cyber war. And we've seen different real cases, and this is just one cyber war example. Only one of them was cyber war. Iran, we all know about the nuclear program. They have an offensive operation, a malfunctioning. That was, in fact, malfunctioning of the centrifuge in the uranium enrichment plant, and so their nuclear plant was delayed for 2 years. And it was a USB stick that was infected. It was a Stuxnet. Was it online? No, it was an independent offline network, and yet they got there. Is it a cyber attack? Is it an armed attack as part of war? No, it's just cyber sabotage. And just like this, with this slide, I've finished my presentation. And we only have little time, I'm afraid, for questions, but I'm open to any questions you might have.
Sí.
Estamos de acuerdo en que un incidente en materia de ciberseguridad
I'm afraid they are not using the microphone, or else it is off.
Sí, la pregunta.
Yes, your question, let me repeat it for everyone. In case of a cybersecurity incident with a cross-national component inside the organizations where we armed forces work, such as NATO, is there any joint activity for response? What we do is share information about the incident together with national bodies and international bodies, such as NATO, so that they learn about the attack that is happening and they can react and reorient their defenses to stop it. But what about the reaction? There are two options. There is one way that would be solving the problem and restoring the service. This is one, and that's a national approach, fully national approach, and they each respond. Each country, I mean, if they have the capabilities, and if not, they can ask for help to the organization, but not as an offensive defensive way of responding. If it would be, we have an attack, an incident, causing casualties in a country on the cyberspace, can we invoke that clause or article that allows us for collective defense as a country? Yes, but needs to be understood as an armed attack with given effects. That would be harm or damages. So we need to understand it as cyberspace war so that we can invoke that clause for collective defense. But it has not happened. Actually, even Estonia, when there was this attack there was not an attack that was part of an armed conflict. So it was not an option to invoke said clause. It was just cyber sabotage. And without a proper attribution, an accurate attribution to any given country, there is suspicion who could be interested in the action, but there was no proper legal attribution. Any more questions?
Bueno, repito la pregunta.
So let me repeat the question once again, because I guess the microphone is not working. Is it possible to spot the source of the attack? Can we understand where it comes from, or do they go unpunished? Yes, there are attacks for which we can find the geographical origin, that cyber person who threw it, or the physical person behind it. But it ain't easy at all. Most of the incidents, most of those problems just go unpunished. Because first, lack of traceability. This is a technical item, and we really need to justify before a judge we need to bring those technical data to see this is all the traceability, and then attribution. So it's been this, and the one person is this, their ID number is this, and that's traceability. But we need technical and legal, and that way we get authorship, who's been the author, the perpetrator rather, sorry. And that way we can take actions against an individual, or else retaliation as a state against a different state. So that would be a state perpetrator or agent. But as you might know, anonymity is quite a component. It's very serious, and attribution is not so common. Could we combine war and cyber defense into a real operation? Yes, of course, for sure. We work in different dimensions. E-war works within the electromagnetic range, and we work on the cyber range or space. But as part of the cyberspace, do we take also part of the electromagnetic spectrum? Yes. Communications amongst different information systems might travel through a Wi-Fi system or satellite or radio linking, and it is all electromagnetic, and we do use it in the cyber world to communicate to get our systems to communicate. So any military operation that has a cyber component, almost for sure it will have some e-war components, plus a few others, land and sea and air force. But what matters here is if there's an operation where there is an action in the cyberspace, which is military action, for sure they will have, or almost for sure, they will have an e-war component. Any more questions? If there are no more questions, thank you very much for your attention. I hope I didn't bore you. Thank you.